Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. New York Times reporting on a recent study that suggests raising the minimum wage could lower suicide rates.
Please. That $1.50 is really going to change it. I'm pulling for you.
The study examined suicide rates from 1990 through 2015 across all 50 states and Washington. Measured how they changed as the minimum wage increased over that time period. At the state level, of course. Researchers focusing on adults between 18 and 64 with a high school education or less, a group more likely than others to be affected by changes in the minimum wage. This is done by a doctoral student in epidemiology at Emory University. When controlling for changes in the state's economy and welfare policies, the researchers estimate that a $1 increase in the minimum wage corresponded with a 3.5% decrease in the suicide rate for those with a high school education or less. Without some of the controls, the decrease in suicide was 6%, the effect most pronounced during times of high unemployment. The doctoral student, John Kaufman, concedes there are possible alternative explanations to what we saw, but these aren't crude associations. These aren't mere correlations. We designed the study to account for multiple types of alternative explanations. A spokesman for Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah responding to this study. Our reading was the paper showed that a higher state minimum wage over the federal minimum wage is correlated with less suicide. By this logic, if we raise the federal minimum wage while keeping the state minimum wage constant, suicide would go up. Or we could really reduce suicide by eliminating the federal minimum wage entirely, thus creating a huge gap between the state minimum wage and the federal one. These seem nonsensical. Yeah. Also, just the underlying contention or premise, really, that the trend upward in suicide, as Dr. Leonard Sachs describes it when we spoke with him, is mainly attributable to your hourly wage, or significantly attributable to your hourly wage, and that the hourly wage increase would have that kind of impact across that population. Sort of runs afoul of historical data. So it's the same thing as saying, well, it's drug and alcohol abuse. Well, point of fact, in this particular cohort, drug and alcohol abuse has not increased significantly over the time period prior to the trend upward now to current. So there's something else going on that explains the trend going up at maybe not a 45-degree angle, but maybe a 30-degree angle. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined, generally speaking, by Nicholas Eberstadt. He's the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of the forthcoming book, How to Educate an American, The Conservative Vision for Tomorrow's Schools. Well, that will be worth a read. And he wrote an expansive piece for nationalaffairs.com about the percentage of men of working age who are not working, and not because they're not job opportunities, but because they've effectively dropped out of the labor market. Nicholas Eberstadt, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Before we get to the piece that I'm referencing, did you have any immediate reaction to that study about suicide that we were describing?
I haven't read it yet, so I don't think I can offer any informed assessment. Okay,
fair enough. In your piece, it's interesting. You start with sort of the demand side explanations for the decrease or the stasis in male employment, and the things that are talked about a lot: the changing economy and people that without the college diploma that need to do skills retraining and those sorts of phenomenon, those sorts of challenges. But then you go into the less talked about aspect of why there are a lot of men who could be in the labor market who aren't. You talk about the supply side dynamics that we don't talk a lot about. So talk about some of those supply side dynamics that factor in.
Sure. I mean, the received wisdom and the consensus is that the problem of men without work is a demand side issue, as you indicated, and there's a lot of truth in that. It certainly has been that way in the past since more or less economies began. But we've got new things going on that I don't think we're paying enough attention to. I mean, consider this. The work rate, the employment to population ratio, for guys who are called in the prime working ages, 25 to 54, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics designation, as of the most recent monthly jobs report, was almost up to the level that was reported for that same group in the 1940 census, which means in 1939. So we're almost up to 1939 work rates for prime-age men in the United States today. It's a Great Depression scale problem. And 4 out of 5 of the men who do not have jobs are not looking for them. This is called the not in labor force group, the inactivity rate, there are different names for it. If you plot that inactivity rate from the mid-60s to the present, you get almost a straight line, that doesn't make sense if you believe that this is a demand-side problem. If you believe it's a demand-side problem, you should have big shocks when we had the Great Recession, and you should have had visible shocks when we had previous recessions between 65 and 2008, 2009. Maybe also big shocks when China entered the World Trade Organization or when we came up with disruptive technologies. Can't see any of that stuff. Instead, you see almost a steady rising tide. That's not what a demand shock looks like. Give you another example. As we all know, the situation has been particularly brutal with men with lower educational attainment. And for guys who are high school dropouts, the work rates today look pretty dismal. But not having a high school degree is not consignment to labor force failure for everybody in this group. There are remarkably different paths that one can see within this group. For example, if someone is a foreign-born and married high school dropout, 25 to 54 years of age, their odds of being in the workforce, their labor force participation rate, is basically indistinguishable from an American native-born college grad. On the other hand, if you're born in the United States and you've never gotten married, your labor force participation rate is abysmal. It's barely over 50%. I mean, it's tragic. So within this single group of high school dropouts, we have a discrepancy in labor force performance of 40%. That doesn't look like something that's being driven by demand-side constraints. There's something else big going on, and that's why I think we should be looking at what I call supply-side problems or institutional barriers.
Well, so
supply-side problems being motivation, and institutional barriers being things that keep people from getting into the labor force.
So one of those barriers you're describing, marriage. That's a real equalizer, and ostensibly because of the responsibilities that are attached to marriage to support a family. One of the institutional factors I think you suggest is welfare state benefits.
Well, I would say that two things that affect willingness, questions, let's say, to be in the mix are family structure and our disability system questions, and an institutional constraint or impediment is having a felony in your background, because there's just a huge explosion of ex-cons. So if you family structure is not something that a lot of social scientists are comfortable discussing these days. It's considered to be in poor form in many circles. But family structure is a absolutely powerful predictor of, among other things, male labor force participation. Now, I'm saying a predictor. That means that's a correlation. That doesn't necessarily mean causation.
Right.
I think anybody who looks at this knows that there's complicated causality and it goes both ways. Okay, I mean there are some people who may be, for example, ill, and that makes them less likely to be able to get married. But there's also being out of a family structure where you have obligations to a spouse and to children, which may have its own impact on your motivation to be in the labor force. What you can say is that it has, irrespective of educational level or ethnicity, the guys, prime age guys who've never been married, always have lower workforce participation levels than guys who are married. And furthermore, kind of interestingly, leave the marriage stuff aside, if a guy has kids under the same roof as him, regardless of whether he's married, separated, divorced, never married, after you do those in controls, more likely to be in the workforce. You can call it a provider effect. What we've seen over the last half century and more, of course, is that the percentage of prime age men who are never married has soared as the percentage of guys who are married has fallen radically. And the proportion of guys with children under 18 living in their household has also fallen dramatically. We would expect, all other things being equal, this to have a big depressing effect on male labor force participation in the U.S.
And so right, so that stands to reason. But what about the what I did mention, which is the impact of welfare state benefits? If these guys aren't working, then they're surviving somehow, and I assume that at least partially on transfer payments.
So, unfortunately for everybody, Uncle Sam forgot to ask how many people in America are receiving disability benefits. And because we have this kind of crazy quilt of different overlapping systems, we've got Social Security disability insurance and SSI from the Social Security Administration. We've got veterans benefits. We've got workman's comp. We've got state and local benefits. There's no office anywhere that I can find that can come up with an accurate count of how many unique individuals are receiving one or more disability benefits. The best I could do was to look at a survey the Census Bureau does, which tracks a number of government benefit programs and tries to see how many people are participating. When you looked at that information, which is incomplete, back in 2013, we're looking in the rearview mirror, a little less than 60% of the prime age guys who were out of the workforce were receiving one or more benefits, and about 2/3 of them lived in a household where somebody was receiving one or more of those benefits. And remember, resources are fungible in the household. Mm-hmm. That's a lot higher than it was in the 1980s in that same survey. Okay, so nobody lives like a prince on disability. It's pretty penurious. I mean, it's a huge, tragic waste of human potential. If it can be avoided, I'd say. At the same time, it's clear that that majority, maybe the overwhelming majority, of men who are not in the workforce are obtaining sustenance through one or more disability program. Eligibility in disability programs also qualifies people for other means-tested benefits. I don't think there's any way that social science can prove whether disability causes the men without work problem. You don't have a way of doing that. What you can show incontestably is that disability programs finance the continuation of the Men Without Work program, and is now a part of the budget of the majority, or perhaps the great majority, of men who are long-termers out of the labor force.
Very useful analysis. He is Nicholas Eberstadt. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of the forthcoming book, How to Educate an American, The Conservative Vision for Tomorrow's Schools, and I will tweet out his piece from National Affairs about men not at work. Nicholas Eberstadt, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Take care.
Listen to Dan and Amy on your smartphone. Download the AM 560 mobile app today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
It's a real-world reality. Gunshots. Sometimes the results are tragic. Now, there's gunshot detection technology and active shooter countermeasure technology available right now. And it was developed for the U.S. government.
Hey, this is Mike Walsh. My company is Walsh Wireless. We are the Chicagoland dealer for gunshot detection technology. This gunshot detection system is nothing short of amazing, and it is highly effective. Who uses it? Government, healthcare, education, houses of worship, entertainment, and a lot more. There are no false positives, and that's good. The system can identify the caliber of the gun, so law enforcement can be prepared.